one.
Today we're going to talk about the European expansion in the Western Hemisphere. So our key concept is that contact among Europeans, Native Americans, and Africans resulted in the Columbian Exchange. And this led to significant social, cultural, and political changes on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. What we're going to talk about today is how European expansion into the Western Hemisphere generated intense social, religious, political, and economic competition and changes within European society. So because the Europeans came to the the Western Hemisphere, to America, it changed Europe. So first, we're going to talk about how European nations' efforts to explore and what we would say conquer the New World started from a search for new sources of wealth, economic and military competition, and the desire to spread Christianity, which leads us to something you talked about in world history, which is the 3 Gs. The 3 Gs is what motivated European explorers and conquistadors to come to the New World: gold, God, and glory. Gold. The idea is to acquire riches for yourself and for your country that you represent. For example, Columbus was not Spanish, but he represented Spain, and he came to the New World to try to find some sort of wealth to bring back to the country that sent him. The Spanish had an obsession with wealth. There's a story about a friar who came to the New World who reports back to Spanish authorities in Mexico City that he found Cibola, the city of gold. Probably what he saw was the yellow dust of the pueblos. Remember, we talked about those yesterday. In the dawn or dusk, which it kind of glitters when the sun is going down or coming up in present-day New Mexico. But that idea of finding gold, finding a city of gold, motivated a lot of explorers to come to the New World. The idea of spreading Christianity, or what we would say God, it sent priests, friars, and missionaries from all over Europe to come to the New World, and the goal was to convert many indigenous people or Native Americans. These new missionaries started churches, particularly Catholic churches, in today's Mexico. And finally, the idea of glory in the New World is that building settlements in this New World would allow the explorers and the mother country to get money, create plantations, start mining, or get other resources, which makes that country powerful. And that power and that prestige is brought to, say, Spain or France or England. So those are our 3 Gs. Then we have this search for the Northwest Passage. There were hundreds of years spent where European explorers searched for a commercial sea route from the Atlantic European coast to the Pacific Ocean, which would be reaching Asia. This goal was to try to find an all-water route to China and India. Columbus searched and failed in 1942, and that's how he, in quotes, discovered America, even though he was one of the last explorers to actually get to America. Henry VII sent John Cabot, a cartographer, a map maker, to try to find a northwest route to Asia in 1497. That didn't work. Francis Drake was also sent by England and failed to find an all-water route. Sir Humphrey Gilbert also was sent to try to find an all-water route to China in 1583, but he actually drowned. He died in his attempt. Finally, Henry Hudson, he discovered the Hudson Bay. Later, his crew overthrew him and 7 others when winter hit and they got really angry. He did not succeed in finding some sort of all-water route to Asia. Eventually, though there were many deaths later, explorers in the late 1800s actually find an Arctic passage, and they successfully go through the Arctic passage in 1905. So it wasn't until really 1905 that we have an all-water route to Asia, but it is dangerous. The last thing I want to talk about here is Roanoke Island. Roanoke Island was first settled in 1585. Queen Elizabeth of England started a late attempt to settle the New World. So think about it this way. Spain and France were way ahead, and England was playing catch-up. There was conflict in Roanoke Island between the new settlers and the Native Americans. Richard Hakluyt, who we're going to look at some of his primary sources, writes of the initial contact. In 1587, there's a second attempt to settle Roanoke Island, and a man named John White, an artist, becomes the governor, and he actually draws his observations, and those are other primary sources we have of this time period. Roanoke Island was known as the Lost Colony because through tragedy or disaster, many leaders left the colony, they went back to England for supplies, and they did not return for years due to hurricanes and other unforeseen issues. 115 English settlers were left on Roanoke Island. And when John White and others returned to Roanoke after a few years of being away, they found that the entire island off the coast of the Virginia, North Carolina area was abandoned. And on a tree, supposedly, there was the word Croatoan written. So we don't really know what happened to these colonists, but that was England's first unsuccessful attempt to settle in the New World. The Columbian Exchange brings new crops to Europe from the Americas. So we're going to talk specifically what comes from America and goes to Europe, and it stimulates the the European population growth. They find new resources, mineral wealth, and it facilitates the European shift from feudalism, where you have lords and serfs, to capitalism, where businesses compete. So we're going to talk really quick. If you look at this population growth, and you see Asia is growing in population and continental Europe is growing in population, and you see that start really around 14 to 1600, and that's because we have new foods coming from the Americas that are high in calories. So here are some of the new crops that are introduced to Europe: squash, pumpkins, vanilla, turkeys, corn, tomatoes, potatoes, peanuts, sweet potatoes, that's kind of exciting, tobacco, pineapples, cocoa, and beans. And all of these are high in calories, and they allow the Europeans to actually live longer, healthier lives because they're exposed to these new types of food. We also see the growth of European nation states. A nation state is a nation or country or state, whatever you want to call it, that keeps power by serving all of its citizens from some sort of sovereign state and location. So an example of this is how the 13 British colonies, which we'll talk about in the next unit, were in North America, but they were ruled by a common state, England. The citizens of these colonies shared in commerce, migration, and they developed a unique culture in America. However, they still identified as British citizens, and England grew more powerful because of this. The colonies existed to benefit this mother country. So you see France doing this, Spain doing this, Italy doing this, England doing this. Those are just a few examples. And the last thing I want to talk about is improvement in maritime technology. Because we see improvement and innovation in new technology, exploring technology, there are more organized methods for conducting international trade, such as developing joint stock companies, and that helped drive change in economies in Europe and the Americas. So first I'm going to talk about the Karabell. There are a lot of different inventions. The sextant is one of them, but I want to talk about the Karabell, which is a new ship. It was used by the Portuguese and Spanish. It was incredibly fast, and it was easy to maneuver. This ship was used by Columbus. The Nina and the Pinta were both Karabell ships. Portugal used the Karabell ships most to explore the coast of Africa. And these ships eventually evolved to carry more weight and sail further, and they were ideal for exploration, trading, warfare, and even piracy. And finally, I'm going to tell you about the joint stock companies. You should have learned about these in civics. In 1600, England was really poor compared to other European countries like Spain, France, and Portugal. Queen Elizabeth feared that settlement attempts would jeopardize England and its treasury, so she and others came up with a new idea for settling the New World, and they came up with the idea of a joint stock company. Sir Walter Raleigh had tried to finance exploration attempts on his own to the New World, but that failed. So joint stock companies formed, and it was like the precursor to a modern corporation. What they did, the joint stock companies sold stock to rich investors, and that provided capital to people who were going to go to the New World and settle with very small risk, very little risk to these investors. The investors stayed in England. They each put in however much money, say $1,000, $10,000, but it would be in pounds, of course. And the people who would settle in the New World would use that money to set up a colony, and then they would work, and anything that they made, any resources that they gathered, they would send back to England, and the investors would receive a return on their profit, or sorry, a return on their investment. Um, a lot of times you see startup costs for these colonies being enormous, and returns took years to get back to the investors. But if you were successful, you've just invested in the New World. Many of the new colonists were second sons of noblemen. They led colonization efforts. We had things in England called primogeniture laws that said the second and third sons could not inherit family land if you were from a noble family. So these second and third sons actually came to the New World to strike out life on their own, basically. Many merchants who disagreed with the Church of England also led expeditions to seek a new life where they could make their own rules, churches, and they could form their own societies. And a lot of the people who followed and became the colonists, not the rulers, but the colonists, were poor people who were actually in jail for debt, who were in jail because of overpopulation, and were sent there because of petty crime, like stealing food because there wasn't enough. They chose to go to the colonies instead of spending more time in jail. So we see a lot of reasons why Europeans came to the New World, and a lot of ways that the New World affected Europe. If you have any questions, please ask.